In 1973, a factory chimney started smoking in Western Kenya. It wasn't just smoke, it was a signal, a promise to an entire region that prosperity had arrived, that the sugarcane fields stretching to the horizon would finally mean something, that farmers who had grown cane for generations without profit would now feed their children, build stone houses, and send kids to university. The chimney belonged to Mumias Sugar Company, and for 3 decades, it delivered on every promise. The factory was massive, the largest sugar producer in East and Central Africa. At its peak, it crushed 8,000 tons of cane per day. 8,000 tons. That's enough sugarcane to fill 400 trucks, arriving every single day from dawn to midnight. The machinery hummed around the clock, 3 shifts, never stopping. The sweet smell of processing cane hung over Mumias town like a permanent blessing. Let me tell you what Mumias meant to Western Kenya. This wasn't just a company, it was an economy. Over 100,000 farmers grew cane for the factory. Each farmer supported a family. Each family supported a community. The money that flowed from Mumias touched 2 million people directly. 2 million. That's larger than the population of Botswana. An entire nation's worth of lives depending on one factory, one chimney, one promise of smoke. The farmers weren't rich, but they were secure. You planted your cane. You waited 18 months for it to mature. You watched the Mumias trucks arrive to harvest and transport. You received your payment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. A rhythm of planting and harvesting that had sustained families for decades. Your grandfather grew cane. Your father grew cane. You grew cane. Your children would grow cane. This was the deal. This was the future. Mumias town itself was transformed. What had been a sleepy rural outpost became a thriving center. Banks opened branches. Hotels sprouted. Shops multiplied. A cinema arrived. Schools expanded. The hospital upgraded. Every shilling that the factory paid to farmers circulated through the local economy, multiplying as it moved from hand to hand. Economists call this the multiplier effect. Residents of Mumias just called it life. The company employed 3,000 people directly. Good jobs. Factory jobs. The kind of jobs that came with medical insurance, pension contributions, and a sense of dignity. Working at Mumias meant something. It meant you'd made it. The blue overalls with the Mumias logo were worn with pride. Families celebrated when their children got jobs at the factory. It was the golden ticket, the guarantee of a middle-class life. By the 1990s, Mumias was producing over 250,000 tons of sugar annually. That was 60% of Kenya's sugar output. 6 out of every 10 spoons of sugar in Kenyan tea came from Mumias. The company was listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. Investors competed to buy shares. The dividends were reliable. The growth was steady. Analysts call it a blue chip stock, safe as houses, boring in the best possible way. The factory was more than profitable. It was printing money. Revenue exceeded 10 billion shillings annually. The profits funded expansion. Investments in ethanol production, power generation from sugarcane waste. The company was diversifying, modernizing, future-proofing, or so everyone believed. This is where I need you to understand something important. Success in Kenya, especially success on this scale, attracts attention. The wrong kind of attention. When billions of shillings flow through a single institution, people start circling. Politicians who want their share, brokers who want their cut, managers who want their bonus, directors who want their fees. Everyone wants a piece. And eventually, the pieces add up to more than the whole. Mumias became a feeding trough. Not immediately, not obviously, but steadily, persistently, inevitably. The corruption crept in like termites, invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere, hollowing out the structure from within. Let me explain how they stole Mumias. Because this wasn't one big heist. It was 1,000 small betrayals, each one justified, rationalized, and hidden in the complexity of agribusiness. It started with the managers, the people responsible for buying cane from farmers, scheduling harvests, and managing operations. They discovered that their positions came with opportunities. A truck could be diverted, cane could be weighed incorrectly, payments could be delayed, while interest accumulated somewhere else. Small frauds that added up to large fortunes. A farmer would deliver 10 tons of cane, but the records would show 8. The missing 2 tons sold separately. The money pocketed. Multiply this by thousands of transactions. Every day, every harvest season. The theft was industrial in scale, but invisible in execution. How do you audit a cane field? How do you verify that the truck carried what it was supposed to carry? You can't, and they knew you couldn't. Then there were the directors, the board members appointed to oversee the company. They were supposed to represent shareholders, to protect the investment, to ensure good governance. Instead, they saw opportunity. Contracts for supplies that went to their relatives, tenders for services that went to their friends, consultancy fees for advice that was never given. The boardroom became a marketplace where positions were traded for access and access was traded for money. The procurement system was the biggest honeypot. A sugar factory needs everything: chemicals for processing, spare parts for machinery, fuel for trucks, uniforms for workers, office supplies, cleaning materials. Each purchase was a chance for someone to insert themselves into the chain, to add a markup, to extract a commission. By the time the corruption was entrenched, nothing could be bought at market price. Everything cost 30%, 50%, sometimes 100% more than it should have. The excess went into private pockets. But the most devastating theft wasn't inside the factory. It was outside, in the cane fields, where a different kind of robbery was taking place. The brokers arrived in the late 1990s. Middlemen who promised farmers faster payment, better prices, fewer delays. They would buy your cane directly, pay you cash immediately, and handle the complicated business of dealing with Mumias. It sounded attractive. It was designed to sound attractive, and it was a trap. The brokers operated on margins that didn't make sense unless you understood the game. They paid farmers below market rate, transported the cane to Mumias or other factories, collected the full payment, and kept the difference. Some of them didn't even bother with legitimate transport. They stole cane from one farm and delivered it claiming it was from another. The paperwork was forged, the scales were rigged, the system was chaos, and chaos was profitable for those who understood it. Farmers who had once dealt directly with Mumias found themselves frozen out. The company's own harvesting trucks stopped coming. Appointments were delayed. Payments took months instead of weeks. Unless you knew a broker, unless you paid the facilitation fee, unless you played the game. By the early 2000s, the rot was visible even from outside. Factory capacity utilization began falling. The machinery that had once crushed 8,000 tons daily was now processing 5,000, then 3,000, then less. Not because demand had fallen, not because the equipment was broken, because the cane wasn't arriving. Where had the cane gone? To rival factories that had opened in Western Kenya, to brokers who diverted supplies to better paying buyers, to farmers who had simply stopped growing because Mumias hadn't paid them for the last 3 harvests. The feedstock that had powered the factory's dominance was disappearing, and nobody at the top seemed to care. This is where the story gets infuriating, because the warning signs were flashing red. The accounts showed declining production. The auditors flagged irregularities. The minority shareholders raised concerns. The union complained about unpaid salaries. Everyone could see the collapse approaching. No one could stop it. Why? Politics. The answer in Kenya is always politics. Mumias was not just a company. It was a political asset. Whoever controlled Mumias controlled jobs, patronage, and votes in Western Kenya. The board seats were distributed according to political calculations, not competence. The CEO position was filled based on which faction was ascendant, not who could run a factory. Every decision was filtered through the question of who would benefit politically, not what would benefit the company. The result was paralysis. Reforms were proposed and blocked. Investigations were launched and buried. Managers who should have been fired were protected. Directors who should have been prosecuted were promoted. The company became a battleground for competing interests, none of which had any stake in its survival. And while the politicians fought, the finances deteriorated. The debt began piling up. First millions, then hundreds of millions, then billions. Loans to cover operating shortfalls. Loans to pay other loans. Loans to meet payroll when sugar sales couldn't cover salaries. The interest compounded. The principal ballooned. The balance sheet turned cancerous. By 2010, Mumias owed money to everyone. Banks, suppliers, farmers, the Kenya Revenue Authority, the National Social Security Fund, the power company, the water utility. Every month brought new demands. Every quarter brought new defaults. The lawyers multiplied. The court cases piled up. The assets that could be seized were seized. The assets that couldn't were mortgaged. Then came the imports. And the imports nearly killed what the corruption had left alive. Let me explain the sugar import situation, because this is where the story becomes a national scandal, not just a corporate one. Kenya doesn't produce enough sugar to meet domestic demand. It never has. The gap between consumption and production is filled by imports, theoretically regulated, theoretically taxed, theoretically controlled. In practice, it's a free-for-all. The system was supposed to work like this. Licensed importers bring in sugar when local supply falls short. They pay duties designed to protect Kenyan farmers. The imported sugar is sold alongside local sugar at prices that don't undercut domestic production. Everyone benefits. The market stays balanced. Here's what actually happened. Cartels figured out how to import sugar duty-free, claiming it was in transit to other countries. The sugar would arrive in Mombasa, supposedly destined for South Sudan or Uganda or Congo. The paperwork would show it leaving Kenya. The trucks would drive north toward the border. Then, somewhere along the way, the sugar would disappear into the domestic market, undercutting local prices by 30%, 40%, sometimes 50%. But it gets worse, because some of these cartels didn't just sell cheap imported sugar. They repackaged it in Mumias branding. Yes, you heard that correctly. Imported sugar, often of questionable quality, was being poured into fake Mumias bags and sold to Kenyans who thought they were supporting local farmers. The real Mumias sugar sat in warehouses, unable to compete on price. The fake Mumias sugar flooded the market, destroying the brand while generating profits for criminals. Consumers couldn't tell the difference. Retailers didn't care. The money flowed to the cartels while the company collapsed. Who were these cartels? Names were whispered. Investigations were announced. Parliamentary inquiries were held. Documents were presented showing shipping manifests, warehouse receipts, bank transfers. The evidence pointed to powerful people, politically connected people, people who could make investigations disappear. Nothing happened. Nobody was prosecuted. Nobody was jailed. The cartels continued operating. The imports continued flowing. The local industry continued dying. This is how Kenya works. Or rather, how it doesn't work. By 2015, Mumias was a ghost of itself. The factory that had once processed 8,000 tons daily was operating at less than 20% capacity, fewer than 2,000 tons, sometimes less than 1,000. The 3 shifts had become one. The 3,000 employees had shrunk to a skeleton crew. The humming machinery fell silent for days at a time. The farmer suffered worst of all. Let me give you one number that tells the whole story. A farmer we'll call John Wafula delivered cane worth 66,500 shillings to Mumias. After deductions for loans, advances, transport, levies, and fees he never agreed to, he received a check for 7,800 shillings, less than 12% of what his cane was worth. The rest had been eaten by the system, by the brokers, by the deductions, by the machine that had been built to extract maximum value and return minimum compensation. John Wafula had spent 18 months growing that cane. He had weeded, fertilized, and protected it from pests. He had waited for the harvest trucks that arrived months late. He had delivered his crop, expecting to pay school fees, buy fertilizer for the next season, maybe put something aside for emergencies. He received barely enough to cover transport costs to the bank to collect his check. Multiply John Wafula by 100,000. That's how many farmers were being betrayed. That's how many families were being impoverished. That's how many children were being pulled from school. That's how many homes were falling into disrepair. The promise of the smoking chimney had become a lie. The government tried to intervene. Bailouts were announced with great fanfare. Billions of shillings allocated. Task forces formed. Turnaround strategies developed. None of it worked because none of it addressed the fundamental problems. The money disappeared into the same corrupt structures that had caused the collapse. The task forces produced reports that gathered dust. The turnaround strategies were sabotaged by those who benefited from the status quo. In 2017, Mumias was placed under receivership. The company that had dominated Kenyan sugar production, that had sustained 2 million lives, that had been the pride of Western Kenya, was handed over to administrators. The admission was total. This cannot be fixed from inside. External intervention required. Life support activated. The receiver found a disaster. Debts exceeding 20 billion shillings. Assets worth a fraction of that. Equipment rusting. Buildings crumbling. Records missing. The forensic accountants who tried to trace where the money had gone found trails that led nowhere. Accounts that had been emptied. Evidence that had been destroyed. The theft had been thorough. The cover-up had been professional. Mumias town felt the collapse like an earthquake. The businesses that had depended on factory payroll saw their customers vanish. The shops closed. The hotels emptied. The bars that had once overflowed on payday fell silent. Young people who had expected to work at the factory like their parents found nothing. They left for Nairobi, Kisumu, anywhere that offered opportunity. The town aged. The streets quieted. The cinema shut down. Walk through Mumias today and you'll feel the absence. The factory still stands, a massive industrial complex that once vibrated with energy. Now, it sits mostly idle, maintained by a handful of workers, processing a fraction of what it once handled. The chimney that had symbolized prosperity releases smoke only occasionally. The promise has become a memory. The farmers who remain are trapped. They planted cane years ago, long-term crops that take 18 months to mature. They can't easily switch to other crops. The cane they've grown has no reliable buyer. The alternative factories are overwhelmed, underpaying, or just as dysfunctional. Some farmers have let their fields go wild. The carefully maintained plots that had once stretched to the horizon are returning to bush. But here's what makes Mumias more than a local tragedy. It's a template, a playbook for how to destroy an African institution. The same forces that killed Mumias killed Pan Paper Mills, another Western Kenya giant that collapsed under the weight of mismanagement and corruption. The same dynamics have crippled Kenya Meat Commission, Kenya Cooperative Creameries, and a dozen other parastatals and companies that once provided employment and stability. The pattern is consistent. A successful institution attracts political attention. Political attention brings appointments based on loyalty rather than competence. Incompetent management enables corruption. Corruption drains resources. Resource depletion leads to operational failures. Operational failures are covered up with debt. Debt becomes unsustainable. Collapse follows. The institution dies. The politicians move on to the next target. This is a cycle that Kenya cannot seem to break. The extractive logic that treats companies as resources to be mined rather than institutions to be built. The short-term thinking that prioritizes prioritizes immediate gain over long-term sustainability. The impunity that ensures those responsible for destruction are never held accountable. Let me tell you about the revival attempts because they illuminate the problem perfectly. Multiple investors have tried to restart Mumias, serious companies with serious money and serious plans. Each attempt has followed a predictable pattern. The investor announces their intention. The politicians compete to take credit. The negotiations drag on while various interests demand their share. Eventually, either the investor withdraws in frustration or the deal collapses amid accusations and counter-accusations. One group offered to inject 6 billion shillings to revive operations. They wanted a 20-year lease to guarantee their investment. They had a track record in sugar production elsewhere. The deal seemed solid. It died in political infighting over who would control the board, who would get the contracts, who would benefit from the revival. Another consortium proposed a different structure: equity, participation, technology transfer, integration with their existing sugar operations. They too withdrew after discovering that the liabilities exceeded what had been disclosed, that the assets were worth less than claimed, that the political interference would be constant. The farmers watched these negotiations with diminishing hope. Each announcement of a revival brings cautious optimism. Each collapse brings deeper despair. They've learned not to trust promises. They've learned that their interests are never the priority. They've learned that the system works for everyone except them. As of 2026, Mumias operates at minimal capacity. The latest administration promises turnaround. The government commits support. The farmers plant cane, hoping this time will be different. Maybe it will be. Maybe the chimney will smoke again. Maybe the trucks will roll again. Maybe the payments will arrive again. But if you ask the people of Mumias, they'll tell you they've heard these promises before. Here's the uncomfortable truth that Mumias represents. Kenya has a governance problem that no amount of investment can solve. You can inject billions into a broken system and the billions will be extracted by the same forces that broke it. You can appoint new managers and they'll be captured by the same interests that corrupted the old ones. You can write new policies and they'll be undermined by the same politicians who undermined the previous policies. The sugar industry as a whole illustrates this perfectly. Kenya has ideal conditions for sugar production. The climate in Western Kenya is perfect. The soil is fertile. The rainfall is adequate. The farming knowledge exists. Every input required for a successful sugar industry is present except one: honest governance. Instead, Kenya imports sugar that could be produced locally. The imports benefit cartels. The cartels benefit politicians. The politicians protect the cartels. The local industry dies. The farmers suffer. The consumers pay inflated prices. Everyone loses except those who control the system. The solution is obvious. Enforce existing laws against illegal imports. Prosecute the cartels. Reform the governance of sugar companies. Ensure farmers are paid fairly and promptly. Support the industry with appropriate policies. Other countries have done this. There's no mystery about what works. Kenya simply chooses not to do it. That choice is made by specific people. Politicians who benefit from dysfunction, businessmen who profit from imports, officials who take bribes to look away. They have names, they have addresses, they could be held accountable. They aren't. And so Mumias stands as a monument to what Kenya could be and chooses not to be. A reminder that this country has the resources, the people, and the potential to build great institutions, and the political culture to destroy them. The blue overalls with the Mumias logo that workers once wore with pride are now collector's items, reminders of an era when the factory meant something, when the job meant security, when the brand meant quality, when the chimney meant hope. Today, the children of those workers have scattered, some to cities, some abroad, some to unemployment that has lasted so long it has become identity. The inheritance they expected, jobs at the factory like their parents had, vanished before they could claim it. The sugarcane still grows in Western Kenya. It waves in the wind, beautiful and useless, waiting for factories that can process it, for buyers who will pay fairly, for a system that serves farmers instead of extracting from them. The wait continues. This is how institutions die in Kenya. Not from external competition, not from market changes, not from technological disruption, from internal predation. From the people who are supposed to protect them, choosing instead to feast on them. From governance that prioritizes extraction over sustainability. From impunity that ensures the destroyers face no consequences. Mumias was killed by Kenyans, by managers who stole, by directors who enabled, by politicians who interfered, by cartels who imported, by a system that made destruction more profitable than construction. The collapse was not inevitable. It was chosen. Every step of the way, someone made a decision that prioritized personal gain over institutional survival. Those decisions accumulated until there was nothing left. The chimney still stands. It could smoke again. The machinery could run again. The farmers could prosper again. The town could revive again. But not until Kenya decides that its institutions are worth protecting. Not until the cost of corruption exceeds its benefits. Not until someone, somewhere, faces actual consequences for actual theft. Until then, Mumias remains what it has become: a ghost, a warning, a 2 million person tragedy that nobody will be punished for causing, a symbol of everything that Kenya builds and everything that Kenya destroys. The sugar in your tea might have come from Mumias once. The sweetness that started your morning represented jobs and farms and families and futures. Now, it probably comes from imports, traveling through the duty-free loopholes, packed packaged by the cartels, profiting the connected while impoverishing the farmers. Every spoonful is a reminder of what was built, of what was stolen, of what was lost. Welcome to the death of Mumias Sugar. Welcome to the business autopsy that reveals murder, not natural causes. Welcome to the lesson that Kenya refuses to learn. The chimney could smoke again, but first, Kenya would have to decide that institutions matter more than extraction, that farmers matter more than cartels, that the future matters more than the feast. Looking around at the other industries collapsing, the other institutions failing, the other promises being broken, that decision seems farther away than ever. The sweetness has turned bitter, and Mumia stands silent, waiting for a country that may never come to save it. This is what happens when nobody stops the theft, when everyone gets their cut, when the institution exists not to produce but to provide. The factory still stands, the chimney still rises, the potential still exists. The only thing missing is a Kenya that wants it to succeed.